Hashiv, welcome back. In this installment we'll have a go at painting the gun on our little figure. I hope you find it useful. We'll start by blocking in the gun with black. Then for our initial layer we'll mix some of the scale colour Caribbean blue into the black until we get a nice grey tone. And we'll paint that over the metal parts of the gun, but we'll leave the black showing in the recesses. That will give us definition between the various parts of the gun structure. And you're going to want to do this over a couple of layers to ensure you get a nice even coverage. I'll leave the muzzle part black just to give it some variation. I'm not sure what the part at the back is called, so maybe a shoulder rest, I don't know. I'm sure all the Americans watching are shaking their heads right now. We're not even allowed assault teaspoons here, never mind assault rifles. Anyway, whatever this bit is called, we'll paint that as well, leaving the underside black to help create a shadow there. Once we have that all blocked in, we'll add a bit of scale colour white sands into the mix to lighten it to a medium grey tone, about the same level of brightness as, say, something like Games Workshop Dawnstone. Now, I don't want to make this overly complicated, so I'm going to opt for a single highlight on this large section. And we're going to paint this on so that when the model is standing level, the highlight will be parallel with the ground. And I'll continue that on the next section, just repeating that angle so that that highlight is still going to be parallel with the ground. Here on the back edge, we're going to pull the highlight down to the lower corner, so the highlight is going to be hard against the shadow on that adjoining front side. Here on these skinny bits, we'll put the highlight around the middle. And the same here on this part on the top of the gun. When you're dealing with relatively large flat sections like this, you can't go far wrong by placing your highlight in the middle. By putting it here, we're still going to have a decent amount of contrast with the front side, as the highlights aren't going to be lined up. Here on the magazine, we'll pull the highlight down to the lower edge. You're going to want to paint this on over a couple of layers to get it nice and solid. With scale colour, I'm especially careful about not painting the layers on too thick, as you can easily create physical textures on the surface. You can actually get a raised edge at the side of your highlight, and then it becomes very difficult to blend out, as that ridge catches any paint you add on top, and it just sort of gets worse and worse over time. So it's better to keep your paint on the thin side so you don't run into any of those issues. You can get away with quite a lot when you're doing non-metallic metal. Try not to dwell too much on what's correct. As long as you build up enough contrast, it's going to look okay. Unless you're going for like a hyper realistic effect, then it becomes a lot more important where your highlights are going. You just want to avoid those fundamental errors like having your highlights line up when two planes change angles. You always want them to be opposing each other. So you want the highlight to stop on one side where the shadow begins on the next one. And that way you're going to be able to maximise contrast. Now that we have those mapped out, we can start to blend them. To do that, we'll dilute the highlight down with a little water to a glaze consistency. Alright, so with a very small amount of that on a brush, gently pull the side of the bristles up and over the edges of your highlight, always moving the brush in the direction of the highlight, letting the glaze dry before applying a new layer. How thin you make this is up to you. Just remember that a thinner glaze will take more layers, but it might be easier to work with than a thicker one. And that's because you're not really going to be able to ruin a transition with a single application of a thin glaze, as it takes multiple layers before you see any noticeable effect. But with a heavier glaze, it's going to give you an almost immediate effect, so it's much easier to make a mistake. When you're doing this, try to vary the length of your brush strokes so that you're not always starting in the exact same spot. If you always start at the same place, paint is going to build up there and you'll end up with a visible edge, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of what you're trying to do. The idea is to fade out the edge that's there, not create a new one. I can recommend using a hairdryer to speed up the drying time between layers. In addition to doing that normal glazing, you can also use that same consistency to paint on thin lines over the edges of the highlight. This is the same sort of idea as stippling, but you're using lines instead of dots. Combining both the lines and the normal glaze tends to speed things up and it lets you develop a slightly more interesting effect. You can do this with thicker paint as well if you like. You can see the edge is still visible after a few layers, but you can tell it's starting to fade out and become less obvious. It's just a case of continuing to apply more layers until you can't see the join. To help smooth things out, you can take some of your original dark grey and thin it down to a glaze consistency. Then just use that to glaze in the opposite direction, moving it away from the highlight. This helps to correct any errors that you may have. For example, it's a little rough here near the top, so we'll push the glaze over that to help fade it back. To continue, we're going to mix some more white sands into the highlight to get a fairly large jump in brightness. And I'll paint this on with a single line right in the middle of the previous layer. And we'll use this as a guide mark to help us develop the highlight. So this line will represent our brightest spot. Once you have that in place, we'll start to paint on lines either side of that mark, painting them on so that they are parallel to each other. And when I'm doing this, I try to ease up in the brush as I get further away from the line so that I leave less and less paint on the surface. That way I have some control over the transparency of the lines so that they get progressively faded the more we stray away from that initial highlight. Now you're going to want to build this up over a few layers, allowing the lines to overlap in order to build up a bit of a textured transition into the highlight. Actually, I think we'll make that guide mark slightly thicker. We're still going to be adding brighter highlights over the top, so I want to give myself a bit more space in order to add them in. We'll also add a highlight towards the bottom of the magazine. To help speed up the blend, you can dilute the highlight down to a glaze consistency and use a few layers of normal glazing, drawing the side of the brush across the highlight to help further blur things out. And the same down on the magazine, just pulling the glaze down over the edge of the highlight, with the goal being to blur out the hard line between the two colours. I'll add a touch more paint to the glaze, making it more of a light layer consistency, and I'll use that to blend out the edges of this small highlight on this thin part of the gun. Just pulling it up over the edge on both sides to blur out that join. Once you're happy with how it's looking, add some more white sands into your mix, making it quite bright this time, still keeping it to that light layer consistency. And we'll use that to add another layer. Again, you're going to start off by painting a guideline in the middle of your main highlight. And you'll need to paint this on over a few layers to get decent coverage. Here on this small section, we'll just use the transparency of the paint to pull the brush into the middle point from either side in order to create a little transition into the highlight. It's quite a small element, so we're not really worried about trying to build up texture there just yet. Next, I'll add a broken edge highlight along the top side of the element, using the side of the brush near the tip and just drawing it lightly against the edge, lifting it here and there so we don't leave a solid line. And we'll try to make the highlight more intense just around the middle of that guide mark. Adding some variation to these edge highlights helps to give you a more metallic feel. You end up with a much more interesting effect than you would if you were just painting a solid line. I first got this idea from watching Ben Comets, but you'll find quite a lot of painters use the same trick once you know what to look for. To continue, I'll take some of that mix and thin it down with a bit of water to a glaze consistency, and we'll use that to blend out our highlights. With very little on the brush, I'll lightly draw the side of the brush up to the guideline, working from either side of the line. And as always, our aim here is to create a fade effect, obscuring the obvious edge of the line so you get the appearance of one colour blending into the next with no obvious join point. You're going to need to build this up over a number of layers until you get the desired effect. But be careful not to overwork the surface. Always allow your layers to dry. I think that's starting to look okay now, so I'll grab some white sands on its own and I'll start to add some small intense dot highlights on that upper edge. That will help to increase the contrast and also add some more variation along that edge, giving us a more metallic feel. I'll build up some of the other highlights on this side now, just cycling through those different grey mixes. Gradually increasing the intensity of the highlight over a number of layers. Again, you don't need to worry too much about getting these looking particularly realistic. Just focus on building up enough contrast to give you a shiny effect. You can see on the magazine clip I'm increasing the brightness towards that lower edge just by layering on brighter greys. Then I come back in adding some edge highlights along the top side where the light would be catching. Adding a little variation by making a few spots brighter. Yeah, I think that looks okay. And I'll do the same sort of thing for the little piece just below the hand, building up the intensity of the highlight towards the bottom until it's quite bright. Then coming back in with the white sand at the end to apply a few small dots just to finish it off. You can see you can get quite a good effect pretty quickly on those smaller parts. It's a bit trickier on the larger sections because your blends are more exposed, but the principle is exactly the same. I'll do the rest of that side in the same way. To finish off that larger section, I'll also add a highlight along the lower edge, using our brightest grey with a fairly thin consistency. Using a thinner consistency when you're painting edges means that you can vary the intensity just by applying more layers. It allows you to build up a gradient into your highlight without bothering to switch between your different paints. So you can see that first layer gives us a fairly dull grey, even though the paint is really bright. Then any little dots we apply over the top become progressively brighter, so we can build up the whole edge, variations and all, just with a single colour. I'm not going to show me developing the highlights on the other side, as it would just be a repeat of the same thing, but we'll take a closer look at the edges so that you get a better idea of how that works. To do them, we'll actually use that same principle of layering up with a single colour, but this time we'll use white sands on its own, and we'll thin that down with some water to get it a little transparent. Now you're going to want to hold the brush at a bit of an angle and lightly draw the side of the brush near the tip along that edge. So you're painting close to the tip but not actually with the tip. You're just using the side of the brush to drag it along the edge to leave a very thin line. Then we can apply a few little extra dots to give the illusion of small glints of light. Hopefully you can see the way we're exploiting the transparency of the paint here. A single pass will look like a medium grey tone. That's because that darker grey will be visible underneath. Then as we add more layers, we can build the intensity up to that bright white sands. It's quite a neat trick, and it saves you from going back and forth to the palette picking up different colours. And you don't have to reserve this just to edge highlights. This is more of a general principle that you can apply to any situation and any colour. The next video we'll be looking at how to paint our socks, and we'll do that with a pretty interesting method. Thanks again, bye for now. Let's try a bit of the Sean Connery in this installment. Okay, what was that? I can't even do Sean Connery, fuck's sake. Scottish man can't do Scottish accent. News at 11. Okay.